I believe it is the left hemispheric view of the world, intellectually jejune and morally bankrupt as it is, that has resulted in what has been called the meta-crisis. Not just the odd crisis here and there, but the despoliation of the natural world, the decline of species on a colossal scale, the destabilization of the climate, the destruction of the way of life of indigenous people, the fragmentation and polarization of a once civilized society, with escalating, not diminishing, resentments on all sides, an escalating, not diminishing, gap between rich and poor, a surge in mental illness, not the promised increase in happiness, a proliferation of laws, but a rise in crime, the abandonment of civil discourse, a betrayal of standards in our major institutions, government, the police, our hospitals, schools and universities, which have all become vastly overweighted with bureaucracy, inflexible and obsessed with enforcement of a worldview that is in flat contradiction to reality and isn't their job to enforce, and the looming menace of totalitarian control through AI. The very thing that originates the problem also militates against seeing the problem, seeing the wider picture. The meta-crisis is the predictable outcome of a complete failure to understand what a human being is, what the world is, and what the one has to do with the other. People say, what can I do? The world is so huge and I'm so small. And sometimes they add, and our planet is so small in an incomprehensibly vast universe. But this is to think in the left hemisphere's terms, measuring and quantifying. All the important changes happen from in here, not out there. Here is the ancient floor, foot-worn and hollowed and thin. Here was the former door where the dead feet walked in. She sat here in her chair, smiling into the fire. He who played stood there, bowing it higher and higher. Childlike, I danced in a dream. Blessings emblazoned that day. Everything glowed with a gleam, yet we were looking away.
It is Dr. Iain McGilchrist's theory on brain hemisphere differences that has drawn me here, from the bottom of Africa to the Isle of Skye. I have been struggling to understand how many of us are living on the same planet but in completely different realities. The world seems increasingly black and white. It's either this or it's that, with no shades of grey. How did we land up here in this divisive, polarized world? I can find no better explanation than the one offered by Dr. McGilchrist. His groundbreaking theory, the result of a lifetime's work, couldn't be more relevant today. Dr. McGilchrist speaks about everything being in relation to one another, that everything is an act of co-creation. So after more than 2 decades behind the camera, I decided to step in front of it, to create something I believe explains the contradictory nature of the times we find ourselves in. Dr. McGilchrist, thank you for having me to your home, and thank you for agreeing to meet me and the grace with which my request was accepted. And
that's very kind.
I'm over the moon to be here and to meet you today. And part of me wants to be dancing around the room, but I'll try and stay in my chair.
That'll probably make things easier for both of us.
I've watched so many videos and podcasts and interviews with you, and every interview starts with an introduction, and you are called, which you are, and the labels are good, a psychiatrist, a philosopher, neuroscience researcher, literary scholar, author. These are used to describe you. How would you describe you without those words?
I've got a checkered career. I've never been keen on sticking to one line. So all my life I've been interested in all sorts of different things and pursued them in such a way that I've probably ruined my career, but there we are. I take an interest in everything, and I really believe that it's not enough to be a specialist in something, because if you only know about your speciality, you don't really understand even that. So you do need to spread your net a bit wide, and no doubt that has its problems as well, but that's the way I've led my life.
Is there something pulling you forward that motivates you to do what you do?
Well, yes. I'm interested in ideas. I'm also curiously interested in the truth. And that's not a popular word these days, a pretty important one though. What I mean by that is, of course, not some single truth that's out there that we can get, and once we've got it, we know the answers to everything. But instead pursuing, is this closer to reality than its alternative? And that's something that goes right across the spectrum in the arts and the sciences. Nature, probably the best known and most prestigious science journal in the world, going back to the mid-19th century, has recently said that it won't publish research, even if it's perfectly good from a scientific point of view, if its conclusions don't conform to the current social narrative. And it seems to me that once you do that, you've thrown away one of the anchors we have in reality, one of the lodestars that can guide us towards truth. And if you just say, well, the truth in science is we ignore all the things we don't like, then really you have just waged war on science.
I read Immoderate Greatness on your recommendation, and it's called Immoderate Greatness, Why Civilizations Fail. And in a nutshell, the author explains how civilizations are hardwired for self-destruction. And your theory of the divided brain puts forward an explanation for why this happens. So let's start with that big picture, because it feels like we might be living in a dark age right now. And if I can quote from your book, The Matter with Things, you said, as is well known, the most desperate, homicidal and tyrannical regimes of the world started out with people having an idea to make humanity better and forcing them to be better. Doctor, what on earth is going on right now?
I do think there's a very real danger of totalitarianism. Two of the most important powers in the world are clearly totalitarian regimes. And there's a sort of strength in being such a regime, because there is no chance for people living under that regime to exercise their independence. They do the will of the state. So I do worry about that, and something we may want to talk about later, but the advance of AI at an exponential rate, with its capacity to monitor and intervene in social life and even the mental life of people, is very worrying. But what I think illuminates a lot of both the current situation that you're alluding to, but also the way in which we inevitably see the world and sometimes find it paradoxical, is dependent on the way in which we get information about and understand the world. Ever since I started learning in neurology lectures in my training about the structure of the brain, something struck me as very interesting, which was that the brain is divided into two halves, and nobody addressed the question why. Why is the brain, the power of which depends on making connections, structured with a divide right down the middle? And this is, for people who are not aware of the structure of the brain, this is a pretty colossal divide. The two hemispheres are largely separable. But there is a band of fibres at the base that connects them. And I remember hearing this in a lecture, that a lot of the traffic across this band of fibres, called the corpus callosum, was inhibitory in nature. In other words, it was, yes, certainly sending information to the other hemisphere, but a lot of the purport of that information was, you keep out of this. And also, it's odd that the brain is asymmetrical. And we learnt about this also in neurology lectures, that there's an expansion of the left hemisphere posteriorly, towards the back, in other words. And this was always said to be to do with the development of language, which is a distinctive human feature. And there are two problems about that. One is that it already exists in the great apes and even in some monkeys, and they can't use language. And the other thing that simply wasn't mentioned is that the most asymmetrical area in the brain is the expansion of the right frontal cortex in comparison with the left frontal cortex. And since in those days nobody knew quite what the right hemisphere was up to, this was an embarrassment. It wasn't mentioned. So I thought there's something here that needs exploration. And people said, oh, please don't research on that because it's a pop psychology issue that was exploded a long time ago. We now know that both hemispheres are involved in everything. And right enough, both hemispheres are involved in everything. But if you'd asked a different question, the sort of question you'd ask of a living being rather than a machine, not what it does, but the way in which it does it, you'd have seen there is a big difference. And that difference I discovered, and I've researched these differences now for about 30 years. Quite early, I discovered that the difference between the two hemispheres is the way in which they pay attention to the world. Now, initially, I wasn't as electrified by this as I should have been. I thought, well, I've been trained that attention was a cognitive function. And therefore, as it were, just another thing the machine, the brain, does. But of course, it's not. It's something very different. Only consciousness can attend to something. A machine can clock information from something, but it can't attend. To attend is to devote your attention in a special way to something, to devote your consciousness in a special way towards something. And so what this is about is an evolutionary problem that all creatures have to solve, which can be put at its crudest: how to eat without being eaten. So in order to survive, you need to be able to manipulate the environment. You need to be able accurately to target something that you need, a seed perhaps, on the background of some gravel, if you're a bird, to pick it up accurately and swiftly and effectively ahead of the competition. And you need to be able to quickly pick up a twig and place it in a nest and so on. So all these things are targeted at manipulating the world, little bits of it. But that's the only kind of attention you're paying, you couldn't possibly survive, because you need at the same time to be attending to everything else, because you won't see the predator that is going to make you its lunch while you're getting your own. And you won't see your kin, you won't see your offspring, you won't see your mate. And these are things you need to be aware of all the time. And so all the creatures we know of, going back a very long time in history, have developed an asymmetry in their neuronal network. And this is of a kind which suggests looking at something very narrowly, very sharply focused, and as a detail on the one hand, and looking at something with broad, sustained, open, non-committed, vigilant attention on the other. And in humans, this has reached its apogee, where the left hemisphere is the one that does that manipulative, narrow beam attention to a detail. It's the left hemisphere that governs the right hand, with which most of us do the grabbing, the picking, the manipulating, the wielding of tools. And the right hemisphere, which sees everything else. So the right hemisphere is the one that sees the whole picture, whereas the left hemisphere only sees tiny parts of it. And I sometimes say the left hemisphere apprehends the world, which comes from a Latin root meaning to grasp onto or latch onto something, whereas the right hemisphere comprehends the world, which comes from Latin root meaning to hold together the whole picture. And this has consequences for the way the world looks. So attention changes the world. And if you pay a specific kind of attention, you see one thing. If you pay a different kind of attention, you see something else. So the ways in which things appear depend on the kind of attention that's paid. And a good example for me is the mountain that's just behind this house. The name comes from a Norse word meaning the sloping rock. And if you look at it, it has a sloping outline. And what that means is that 1,000 years ago, when the Norsemen started coming down here, that was a landmark for them that told them where they were, and what's more, told them to look out for the dangerous bay that is just over there in the sea. It was a place for shipwrecks. They needed to be aware of it. In the 18th century, travellers started to come up here to paint the beautiful landscape, and to them it was a many-coloured, many-textured form of beauty. In the 19th century, people got very interested in geology, and it just happens to be a remarkable example of columnar basalt formation. So they would come and sketch that and see that. To a physicist, it's 99.99% empty space, and the other 0.01%, we don't know what it is. Now, all of these are perfectly good understandings of the mountain. They're just different ways of looking at the mountain. And depending on your kind of attention, which in every case was different, something else stood forward for you. So our attention changes the world. And I'm known for saying attention is a moral act, because it actually changes the world, and it also changes us. It changes the person who's doing the attending. So if you always attend, for example, to everything in a manipulative, detached, dehumanized way, you become that manipulative, unemotional, detached kind of a person with all the problems that go with that. So attention is important. A long preamble, but to come back to your question about what's happening in the world now, I think that what's happening is not that our brains have significantly changed. I mean, the brain is always evolving, so it will have changed. But that over time, every civilization goes through a certain kind of an arc. So in our modern Western civilization, in the Renaissance, there was a most extraordinary flourishing of everything in mathematics, in science, but of course in the visual arts, in poetry, in music. In all respects, there was a great step forward. And then since about the 18th century, when we started to believe that we knew everything, we understood everything, and we could control everything, we have gone further and further into a world which is characterized by sameness, hierarchy, control, and a loss of the sense of the things that really make life worth living. I think this is largely because of a number of factors. One is that, and this is the simplest one, is that the left hemisphere of the brain enables us to grab stuff. It makes us see things isolated, abstracted, inanimate, there for the picking. And of course, that is seductive. As a civilization becomes better established, gains in territory, it begins to find, first of all, that it amasses a great deal of resources, but also that it needs to control this much larger geographical territory. And one way to do that is to have one-size-fits-all rules, a kind of bureaucracy that can be rolled out everywhere. And as a result, all the individuality of people, their uniqueness, their particular context, which means that something that works very well in this society, in this geology and geography, at this moment in history, will apparently also work in another place that has a completely different history. And that is a mistake. I think another thing is that once you have a large and unwieldy bureaucracy, it attracts to positions of power people whose way of thinking is also rather simple. It follows tram lines, it follows algorithms, it follows handbooks of rules, procedures, and so forth. And all the time, the context is lost, the individuality, uniqueness is lost, and the life is lost. And so gradually we move into a world which has lost any kind of coherence or meaning, is made up of fragments that we don't know how to make them fit together, and has no purpose or direction. As a result, I believe people are becoming more and more desperate. I think that's the word. Depressed, yes, but they are desperate. They are deprived of all hope, of all sense of meaning, through a quite mistaken belief that science has told them that there is no purpose or value, that these are things we make up to comfort ourselves. But this is not something science can possibly discover. Science starts from the position that it is not going to consider purpose and values. And that's a perfectly legitimate position to take. And it frees it from the need to look into those things. But because it has ruled them out, it can't announce solemnly that they don't exist.
Many of us today seem to have an almost religious attitude towards science, as if blindly following its dogma is our only way forward. But science has always been a method we use to ask a question, and any question requires doubt. As Dr. McGilchrist says,
the way science progresses is that for a while we entertain a certain position, and then an important piece of research comes along that makes us want to qualify it. And so it is a story, science. Science is a narrative. There is a view that some philosophers take of science, that it is a story of forever changing falsehoods, in the sense that, you know, everything is provisional in science because soon we're going to find a different point of view.
Has our modern scientific narrative, which is a story of materialism and reductionism, helped foster a global shift towards totalitarianism? There's undeniable evidence of this in democratic societies today that, for me, was brought into stark relief by the events of 2020, when the world was ordered to follow the science and complied.
Now, I read Matthias Desmet's Psychology of Totalitarianism when it came out.
Wonderful book.
And I found it one of the most uplifting books I read because of how it ended. Because he was saying, here's how we can make changes and here's how we can think about things. It's been a couple of years. I didn't reread it before meeting you, but he explained how there were, I think, 4 things that needed to align and to happen for society to pretty much lose their collective mind, which seemed to happen, you know, and it almost feels in that kind of way of being, you can't have the other view. You need to have the view of everyone else in order to belong. And if you don't belong, you are dangerous. You're an outsider, and you're no longer part of this group. You know, I found in the last 4 years having viewpoints that weren't the majority viewpoints on the response to the corona pandemic. I don't think they're revolutionary views to take care of people when they're ill, and for doctors to do their best and do no harm and run experimental tests before rolling them out on a population. I don't think these are extreme views, but I have lost many friends who will not, you know, have a conversation with me about these sort of things. And it's that state that we're in with not only the coronavirus or, you know, not only this sort of aspect where the collective is punishing anyone that raises their head above the parapet. And once you understand your left brain theory, left brain dominance point of view of the world, you do see it everywhere and you feel it everywhere. Yeah, I don't know what I was going to end that question with, because now I've been rabbiting on.
Not at all, no. Oh, I think there are a number of things that suggest themselves to me there. I mean, the first is quite simply that the left hemisphere always believes it's right. It is the one that jumps to the conclusion and then sticks to it.
Right.
There's a certain stickiness about the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is, even when it's completely right, is always open to the idea, but I might have got this wrong.
Yes.
And so what you find in this situation is that when a particular line has outlived its usefulness, it was useful for a certain period, but is now leading to an extreme position and is not working. When it's pointed out that this is either no longer working or actually never did work, the people responsible for that policy or that position double down on it.
Yes.
And you see this very much in bureaucracies in hospitals and universities, which are the institutions I know.
Right.
That instead of saying, yeah, well, that, we were warned actually by people like yourself that this wasn't the way to do it, they go, what we need is more bureaucracy imposing more of the same ideas. Yeah. So there's that, the stickiness, the imperviousness of the left hemisphere to evidence, if it's on an idea that it believes is right. And I see this throughout society now, that people don't discuss, and that's really the problem you're saying. If you lose somebody's friendship because of an opinion they hold, I mean, this seems to me sad and wrong-headed in itself. But it also means that we're never going to make any progress, are we, if we don't discuss things? Right. Because it's through the coming together of different points of view that we make progress towards an understanding. Sticking just to your own point of view is not going to be enough.
Yes.
So it seems like a QED that we do need to talk more. Yes. And talking means being reasonable, not stropping and cancelling and throwing a hissy fit, but actually saying, however much I disagree, I want to talk to you about this, because you might actually make a convert for a start. So there's that. And I think the other thing is that I sometimes feel that in all fairness, and I always like to see both sides of a question, as I keep saying. Yes. And I want to say on the one hand and on the other. In Greek, there is this pair of particles, men and de. And you say men on the one hand, and then you say de, but on the other. Right. And I wish we could get that into our discourse. Right. But at the outset, we didn't know anything about this new bug. It was frightening because it was actually killing people. It was more virulent at the outset than it became, which is normal with viruses. Right. Because they, as it were, discover that killing the host is not a brilliant idea. Right. So generally, they tend to evolve to be less virulent. So that's fine. But if I'd been charged with making a decision, I'd have thought, if I don't do something fairly draconian, people are going to say, it's thanks to you that all these people have died, and the government should have been doing something instead of going, well, Right. So I do think that is a fair point. Yeah. On the other hand, I think that they carried on with restrictive measures far longer than they should have done, and they didn't sufficiently take into account the damage that was done by isolating people. So isolating people is something you only do in the most extreme circumstances. And usually you isolate the people who are infected. You don't isolate people who so far haven't been infected. Yes. So there's a lot to say about that, and I don't particularly want to go into the rights and wrongs of it, but I think it was a mess, and I think it's had an impact on society that we will... it's accelerated various changes in society that it'll be hard to reverse.
You did say at some point that you looked at all of that as, if you'll pardon my French, more cock-up than conspiracy. And then when you look at it through your lens, you see how easily it could be bureaucratic passing the buck that leads to all of this response. Let's do everything in case anyone charges us as guilty of doing something wrong. Let's take all the measures. So, yes, I understand.
And to return to hemispheres for a moment, two things are relevant. I need to make a decision now in a panic, which is typical left hemisphere. And also, we better control everything. Right. Because the left hemisphere's raison d'etre is control. Right. That is why we have it. It's controlling, right. Getting, grasping, amassing. But the right hemisphere, meanwhile, is saying, but we're social beings. there's much more to life than what you're taking into account. And we can actually help destroy people's lives, destroy the cohesion of a society, unless we're careful.
What there also is in these increasingly bureaucratic institutions is a lack of accountability of an individual.
Yes.
It's not my job, it's not my, I passed it on, I didn't do it. Or,
No.
And I think that is also problematic when we don't take responsibility for our part that we play in whatever role it is, you know.
I wholly agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
There were so many places to stop you there.
Just comment on that.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that, and I think it's very true, it's a point that was made by Hannah Arendt, who is somebody for whom I have enormous respect. And she said so many wise things. But one was that a bureaucracy is something in which nobody can be held responsible. And that also induces a sense of despair. It's impossible to get anything changed or rectified because nobody will own it. Bureaucracy is inhuman. It is anonymous, organizable, irresponsible in the sense that it won't take responsibility. It is procedural and it is abstract, and it doesn't take any notice of the unique case. So that's the world we're in. And it's also, one difference between the left hemisphere and the right is that the left hemisphere needs to have certainty. It's not happy with, well, it could be this or it could be that. And so it tends to be either or, black and white. And the difficulty there is that almost everything in life can be seen from different points of view. And if you're going to be a reasonable and balanced judge of that, then you have to accept that there's usually something to be said on both sides of a question. Where do you see that in current social debate in public? Hardly at all. And so anyone who wants to say, yeah, but, which I often find myself wanting to do, can easily find themselves in the position where you said something that you're not allowed to say. But wait a minute, I'm not saying there isn't truth in two different positions, but we need to have a reasonable, settled conversation in which we don't attack one another and revile one another and slam a door and stamp off. We say, okay, you say that, that's definitely not how I see things, but I'd be interested in why you see that. And then you say, yes, I suppose I can understand that more. But what would you say if I say that? And that's, I would have thought that is what education should be for. It should be being able to see more than one side to a question. And indeed at school, that was how I was trained. Argue for a certain point of view. Now argue for the opposite point of view. And if you can't do that, you get fixed into this extraordinarily simple-minded, simplistic, and wrong, inevitably, position, because it hasn't taken into account any of the other things that need to be taken into account. And if they are more sophisticated and difficult to express in language, they are more nuanced and implicit, the worse it is. But I would say that all the things that give us joy and happiness in life are not things that can be proceduralized. They can't be written down as so many bullet points and you just get on with them. You have to learn them experientially. People always do say to me, well, what is it we can do? And there is a basic problem to this, which is that if I say, I think we should do the 6 following things, we should all meditate for, half an hour a day. We should change the school curriculum so that the humanities are more important. We should have people in government. I actually believe there should be a department of inverse policy in government, which is funded by government, and their whole purpose is to show that whatever policy is being pursued, the dark side to what this is going to do. I think this would be very good. I'm actually told that in the Knesset there is somebody who is like the devil's advocate, whose job it is to say, but the reason that's not going to work is. I don't know if that's correct, but if it is, it's a step in the right direction.
I'm going to head towards that position. I think that I want that job.
Yes. So I do think there are things we can do practically that would help.
Right.
But once again, it's not the obvious and the explicit that really needs to be changed. It's something so huge, so important, so all-embracing, that unless we make that kind of change, tinkering around the edges is not going to be enough. And so, to use a horrible cliche, I do think we need to change our hearts and minds. Mm-hmm. I think we need a different way of looking at the world. And the difficulty is that if we go to outcomes, typical left hemisphere move, let's go to the outcomes, right, then we skip the process which will lead to good outcomes, mm-hmm, and we close down what those outcomes will be. Yeah. Whereas if, as I believe, we are able to adopt more broadly a different lens through which to think about what a civilization does and is for, then we will automatically be making better decisions. Mm-hmm.
What Dr. McGilchrist said reminded me of someone who had made an impact on me, a man who helped bring peace to my country, for a time at least, a country that had literally enshrined black and white thinking into law.
I was lucky enough to interview Desmond Tutu quite some time ago, one of the best interviews I ever did, because he was someone who touched my heart through the interview, and he shone with goodness and kindness and compassion, and he lived a life like that. He was a man that, you know, put his money where his mouth was. And one of the quotes that he's famous for saying is, if you want peace, speak to your enemies, not your friends. And that is, you know, position where the kind of thinking we should be doing now, because all we do is talk to our friends and not our enemies, and we can have no progress if we can't come to some sort of agreement with one another.
One of the things that is now happening is a kind of reviling of human beings because of frankly the mess that we have made of the world in the last few hundred years. And I think that two things are being conflated there. We have undoubtedly followed the wrong path, and my way of understanding that is that we have followed only what the left hemisphere tells us: grab, acquire, get, and all the things that the right hemisphere understands have been neglected. But I don't think that the response to that should be to despair of humanity or to revile humanity. What would help would be if we could stop thinking of human beings as essentially dangerous, stupid, evil, and start seeing them as effectively capable of kindness, of selflessness, and of love. Mm-hmm. These are other important truths about human beings, and ones that I've seen so much evidence of in my life.
Yeah. Just to talk, to comment on the way people look at them as human beings from the mechanistic view and the machine model, and how we are not that, and why are we talking about ourselves in that way, as, you know, neurospeak, referencing wiring in our brain and modules and inputs, outputs,
yes,
when we are nothing like machines.
Data banks.
Data banks and encoding.
Yes.
And you've said, you know, the only thing that is machine-like are machines that we have built.
Yes.
Nothing else in nature is like a machine. So why are we talking about ourselves like this?
I mean, in brief, it's part of the left hemispheric dominance, because the left hemisphere is the part of us that makes things happen, makes machines, makes tools, and uses them. So it's the exploitative in us, whereas the right hemisphere is the explorative in us.
Right.
And so what it's doing is it's looking at something, and it thinks the way to understand this is to take it to pieces, because everything that the left hemisphere understands is something it has put together from pieces to make, and that is a machine. That's what a machine is. But living things are not like machines.
It feels that everything is through the quantitative lens, where everything is sliced up and given a numerical value. You know, we were chatting a bit earlier. Now I'm back at university and learning. You can measure everything, it seems, and I can't understand that. I mean, I see where it can be useful, but it
Yes.
leaves a lot of who we are out in the process, and it becomes almost increasingly more important to be able to put a numerical value to something. It's not going the other way towards looking at the big picture. It's going more towards everything should be, you know, a test or a box tick or a, and I struggle with that greatly.
I can sympathise very much. And of course, while it's very useful to be able to measure things that can be measured, it's a mistake to think that everything can be measured. And often when one thinks one's measuring something, one's measuring a remote proxy for what it is that is really important. And that can distort things badly. So recently I gave an interview to a podcast that obviously had a strong following amongst reductionist scientists. And I said, love is not something that you can generate at will in the laboratory, reproduce, measure, and objectify. And various commentators said, of course you can. You can do a scan of the brain. And, well, as somebody who's done a certain amount of scanning of brains, I can really tell you that this is not... there's a sort of fantasy amongst people who don't know a lot about the process that somehow we can look into the brain and see what people are thinking by measuring things on a scan. But you can't. You can measure proxies, but you can't measure the experience of love, and it can't be given a number. And in fact, this is true of pretty much everything that we value. So you can't schematize and give a numerical value to a work of art, to a poem, to a piece of music, to the experience of wonder, to the experience of something spiritual, to the effects of myths and narratives. All these things are very important and convey real meaning, but they can't. I mean, it seems so obvious that it's a shame that one has even to say it, but quite clearly these things are not quantifiable.
When I've tried to explain your theory to people who know nothing about it, and they can't grasp the impact of a world that has shifted to a left hemisphere dominant point of view, how can you explain to someone who doesn't quite get it the importance of what your theory is putting forward? You know, they're like, well, I think with both parts of my brain. I don't, you know, they don't quite get it.
No. Well, the first thing I ought to say is, of course, we all use both parts, both hemispheres all the time.
Yes.
That is not my point. But what is important is to see that they do actually produce two different worlds that are fused or alternated so rapidly below the level of consciousness that we're not aware that there are these two takes. I mean, if we were aware of them, we wouldn't be able to live. We would be constantly going, you know, what am I to think? What am I to listen to? So we get into, just very briefly, describing these two worlds. And one of them is the world of the left hemisphere, which is made up of pieces. The pieces are static. They're frozen so that you can quickly grasp them. They are disconnected from everything else. They're taken out of context. They're made abstract. They're categorical in nature, and they're inanimate. And they are, in fact, not what the world is like. What the world is like is how the right hemisphere sees it, which is that nothing is ever fully fixed and certain, which doesn't mean everything is random. It just means that nothing is ever finally fixed, that everything is interconnected ultimately with everything else, that everything is flowing and changing, that what exists in a context, which is why making it explicit and dragging it out into abstraction changes its nature. That everything is ultimately unique and it can be classed together in groups, which doesn't mean that they're just substitutable one for another, and that this world is animate. And the difference is the difference between a map in the left hemisphere and a world that is mapped as perceived by the right. And what I say is that the right hemisphere allows things to be present, to come into being for you as you attend to them. And the left hemisphere immediately represents it. And represent is an interesting word because it suggests that you can make something present again after it's actually no longer present. So the left hemisphere doesn't really have contact with the world. It has contact only within its own scheme. So if something coheres within the theory it has, then that's fine. But if it doesn't fit with the theory, then it's neglected. The right hemisphere, meantime, is saying, but it might be different. V.S. Ramachandran, who's a well-known neuroscientist, calls the right hemisphere the devil's advocate. So it's saying not so fast. The left hemisphere tends to be quick and dirty and usually gets things wrong as a result. The right hemisphere is our reality tester. It is the one that is really in touch with reality. And so the problem, as I see it, is we're mistaking the real presence of the world, which is rich, complex, beautiful, has moral implications, for a bloodless, skeletal diagram of the world, a map. A map is fine. A map is useful. I'm not against maps. But if you think that the map is the whole world, you've made a big mistake. You can't live in the map. And that's where I believe we've got to now. And you can see it in the way in which the virtual is substituted for the experiential.
In your book, you quote Margaret Mead, "Never doubt a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And I've heard you say change can be brought about by as little as 3% of people changing their hearts and minds, for want of a better phrase.
Well, yes, it's a reason for hope, I think, because I mean, I've certainly seen in my lifetime some changes for the worse that have come about because of a very vocal small group of people with a rather odd point of view that has carried everyone else with it. But I think that equally, when we're up against the wall and things are really importantly in need of change, which they are now, a certain point of view that seems to suggest an understanding of why we're like that and how we can be different can be mobilized. I believe I'm contributing to a different point of view. And what I've tried to do is to make something that is not necessarily simple and certainly not simple-minded, nonetheless comprehensible to people who have no specialist training. So I always put myself in the position of, so if I were a reader who wasn't trained in this particular area, what would I not be getting here? So I always try to
That's why I liked it so well, Doctor.
That's why?
I liked it so well.
Oh, right.
I could understand it all.
Towards the end of our conversation, I confessed I hadn't quite finished reading The Matter with Things. Volume 1 explains the ways we might discover truth through reason, science, intuition, and imagination. Volume 2 asks, what then is true? I have now finished the book, and this is what resonates.
The overall purpose of The Matter with Things was to help us come to a better understanding of what a human being is, what this earth is, and what the cosmos is like. These are the big questions, and I think we've got them wrong. I believe that consciousness is foundational, that nothing is behind consciousness. Consciousness is ontologically primitive. Consciousness is always attending somehow to something, and the attention it pays is bound up with what it values. I'm against the idea that values and purpose are just things that we make up in order to paint pretty pictures on the walls of our hermetically sealed chamber in which we live. I believe we are truly in touch with something other than ourselves in the cosmos. So what is all this about? And I believe the answer is that we evolved because the universe is relation, and therefore it requires a relation with something that is responsive to it. It is coming into being at the same time that the cosmos is coming into being. It and the cosmos are in something like a dance together, in which each is becoming more aware of its own potential. Potential is being actualized all the time by the cosmos. And in so doing, reverberances, resonances, relationships are being created that are themselves the point of the thing. In the sense, the dance is not to accomplish something. We don't dance together in order to achieve something.
Childlike, I danced in a dream. Blessings emblazoned that day. Everything glowed with a gleam.
The thing itself is the point. The dance is the point. That is the way to think about the universe. That our lives and it are not problems to be solved, are not equations to be resolved. They are a dance to be inhabited, to enjoy, and to suffer with, because both are given to us, to see something wonderful, to feel connection and compassion with it, and to realize that all is not limited to this small understanding that we, in our hubris, think is everything.
Everything glowed with a gleam.
Yet we were looking away.
Wherever you are, you can create beauty. Moment by moment, you can create beauty.